through the shared partnership between India and the United States. Climate change, we all know, has been a major focal point not only for India but also the world. India is the president of the G20 in September. What do you think the delegates or the leaders who will be attending this summit, what should they focus on when it comes to climate?
Well, I think when it comes to climate, we actually very quickly get to the issues we confront with respect to China. All too much of alternative energy supply chains and sectors of our economy are completely reliant on production in China, which is not a constructive way forward. So I think India can show some real leadership at the G20 by including the business community, the global business community, showing that there should be ways going forward to promote foreign direct investment in places like India, to provide alternatives to reliance on China for much of these products. Solar panels, critical minerals, there's a whole host of components within that supply chain where we're way too reliant on China for those supplies. So if India can help the rest of the world diversify the supply chains with respect to climate change, that would be a really wonderful thing, I think, for the whole globe.
All right, I've been talking to Lester Munson. He's a senior fellow, National Security Institute, and also our correspondent, Susan Teherani. Thank you guys for talking to us on WION World is One. We are still waiting for the Prime Minister to make his way to the White House for the state dinner. Let's talk about what will be expected on the menu and the items on the state dinner menu. The White House officials are said to be going all out for this event. A specially curated vegetarian meal will be prepared for the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, as indicated by our correspondent Jessica Stowe. Now, the festivities will take place on the South Lawn of the White House, and the guests have already started arriving at the venue. Even the decor has been customized to amalgamate American and Indian culture. So what are the dishes on the menu? And what's more at the state dinner? Here's a report.
A special plant-based menu has been curated for Indian Prime Minister Modi. Why? No points for guessing. It's because the Indian Prime Minister Modi is a devout vegetarian. This is understandable, as a significant number of Indians are vegetarian. The First Lady, Jill Biden, has worked alongside the chefs to create the menu. Who are the chefs?
To introduce Chef Nina Curtis.
Guest Chef Nina Curtis.
Thank you, Dr. Biden. Hello, everyone.
And White House Executive Pastry Chef Susie Morrison have tailored the menu.
As some of you may know, Prime Minister Modi is a vegetarian. So we asked Chef Nina Curtis, a plant-based pioneer, to work with our White House chefs and create a stunning vegetarian menu.
Along with the Indian PM, over 400 guests are invited for the dinner. So, what should the guests expect? What's on the menu? For the first course, there will be a marinated millet and grilled kernel salad, along with compressed watermelon and some tangy avocado sauce. For the main course, guests will be served stuffed portobello mushrooms. There will also be a creamy saffron-infused risotto. Upon request, guests can have a lemon dill yogurt sauce and summer squashes. There will also be an option to add fish to the main course. The fish dishes will include a sumac roasted sea bass. Now let's see what's for dessert. There will be a rose and cardamom infused strawberry shortcake, But what is dinner without some wine? The state dinner will have a variety of wine for the guests. There will be a Stone Tower Chardonnay Christie 2021, a Patel Red Blend 2019, and a Domaine Carnero Brut Rosé. Although the state dinner has a stunning menu, it is just the tip of the iceberg. The First Lady worked with David Stark Design and Production to tailor the dinner's ambience. From the design of the invitations to the decor and the south lawn, designers have merged American and Indian styles. How will they give the event an Indian touch? Well, the inspiration comes from India's national bird. The White House Social Secretary Carlos Elizondo says that the inspiration for our design really began with the peacock. We wanted to evoke that breathtaking feeling when it extends its tail, unveiling its colorful beauty, majesty, and strength. The pavilion is set to be draped in rich greens with saffron flowers on every table. The design represents the colors of the Indian flag. What's for the evening entertainment? Decorated artists will be performing. They include Joshua Bell, an American violinist and conductor, the United States Marine Band Chamber Orchestra. The White House Social Secretary has said that President Biden and Prime Minister Modi will give their toasts from an eagle lectern, a ritual that leaders have done at state dinners for decades. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
All right, so we are counting down to the key moment as the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be hosted at the White House for a state dinner by the Bidens. The Indian Prime Minister, remember, a little while back took the center stage in the heart of America's democracy in a rare honor, demonstrating the deepening India-US ties. The Indian Prime Minister made a second address to the US Congress. Now, these are live visuals that are being beamed straight out of the White House in Washington, D.C. In some time from now, the Indian Prime Minister will be hosted by the Bidens in what is being at this moment dubbed as a state dinner for the Indian Prime Minister. And for the first time in recent history, what is interesting is that the White House will be hosting this state dinner that is entirely going to be plant-based. So there will be no meat, there will be no dairy, and there will be no eggs as part of the menu. And that's because the Indian Prime Minister is, of course, a strict vegetarian, although it is not clear as to why there is no dairy products in the menu that is going to be served. The dinner will, of course, see 400 VIP guests who will be in attendance. And this, of course, is going to be one of the key aspects of the Indian Prime Minister's visit in Washington, one of the most high-stakes diplomatic tours of the Indian Prime Minister to strengthen ties with the United States. So some pretty important big dignitaries are making their way in for the state dinner. And Nina Curtis, the chef, the White House has said that the menu has been curated to showcase the best of the American cuisine that's been seasoned with Indian elements and flavors. This is, of course, what has been said by Nina Curtis, the chef at the White House, who's been brought in as a guest chef for the dinner. Now, Curtis is, in fact, specializes in plant-based cuisine. And she's, in fact, gone on to state, and I quote her here, throughout her culinary career, she's witnessed the remarkable power that food has on people, saying that the menu for the state dinner allows guests from both countries to experience something of the other's culture. So the dignitaries are, of course, walking in for the state dinner, quite a few of them. And now, remember, this is going to be an extraordinary sort of a state dinner. Now, at this moment, there are no specifically Indian dishes on the menu. Many Indian spices and flavors, however, have been incorporated. The first course will include a salad that will be made with marinated millet, grilled corn, and compressed watermelon with an avocado sauce. That is what has been reported. The main course in this dinner will be stuffed portobello mushrooms with creamy saffron-infused risotto. This is what has been reported. The dessert in the state dinner will be an Indian spice take on American classic, which is a rose and a cardamom-infused strawberry shortcake. So in a short while from now, the Bidens will be hosting the Indian Prime Minister for an official state dinner in which 400 other people will, of course, take part. So you can, of course, look at all the people who are, in fact, making their way in for the official state dinner that has been readied for the Indian Prime Minister as a part of the proceedings. Many celebrities, many business personalities, politicians, amongst others, are, of course, making a beeline for the seat of power in the United States of America. These are live visuals that are being beamed straight out of the White House. And also what is interesting in the state dinner is if the guests were to so desire, then they can request fish, a sumac roasted sea bass, along with crisp millet cakes and summer squashes. The wine options include a red blend from an Indian-owned vineyard in the Napa Valley in California. That's another little bit of an interesting detail that's been put out. Now, millet is going to be the main feature in the menu, and this is a nod to India's efforts to make 2023 the year of the millet, is what the White House has now officially said. The White House occasionally invites guest chefs to help plan state dinners, and just to give you a brief of how this process is done, back in the month of April, when the South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol had visited the White House for a state visit, First Lady Jill Biden had brought in Edward Lee, who is a Korean-American chef with restaurants in Washington and Louisville, as a key guest chef. And this time round, it is Chef Nina Curtis, who specializes in vegan food, who has, of course, been brought in for this special state dinner, which is going to be, of course, be hosted by the Bidens, in which the Indian Prime Minister is, of course, the key invitee. And also to give us more perspective in terms of what, of course, is to be expected and what has happened so far as a part of the state visit by the Indian Prime Minister, we're being joined by Ms. Elizabeth Braw. She's joining us from London. She's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And we also have Siddhant Simon, who's joining us live from the White House. But Ms. Elizabeth Braw, let me in fact begin with you. This of course has been such an important visit by the Indian Prime Minister to the United States. It's his first official state visit, and the importance of this visit has been underlined by the statement that the American President in fact made in the lawns of the White House, where he said that this relationship between India and the United States is the one that will define the 21st century. Why do you think the Americans are placing such importance on this relationship with India?
We are in the midst of a massive geopolitical realignment. The system that the world built up over the past 3.5 decades is crumbling, and that system was the inclusion of China and Russia in the global system, and the immense focus on China in particular as a political and especially trading partner. Now all of that is deteriorating and in some cases crumbling, and that means that for political and economic reasons, Western countries, including the US, have to look to alternatives, and India has been a runner-up to China all this time, and now it's emerging as the top contender to replace China as the top partner, trading and political partner for the West.
Absolutely, indeed. Do continue to stay on this, Ms. Elizabeth Braw. Meanwhile, we are looking at visuals that are being beamed straight out from the White House in the United States, and we are expecting the Indian Prime Minister to make his way back into the White House again. Now, remember, this has been a crucial visit. The Indian Prime Minister a little while back also addressed the joint sitting of the American Congress, where he stressed upon how this relationship between the United States and India is so important. He also said that the time for war is over. This is not the era of war. He also insisted that peace and negotiations and talks is the only way forward. The Indian Prime Minister there being hosted by the Bidens, received by the Bidens at the entrance of the White House. And this, remember, is going to be such an important visit, which is, as has been said through the day and through the night, is in some ways, the United States is, of course, looking for new allies, and it is now looking at India as a key partner in taking on a belligerent China, because the geopolitics of the region and indeed the world has changed the last decade and a half. The rise of China has made a lot of things very, very interesting, and the United States is, of course, looking at India as a reliable partner in taking on a very belligerent China. And my colleague Siddhant Sibal is also joining us on this broadcast. Siddhant, we just saw the Indian Prime Minister arrive at the White House there. He was received by the Bidens, and we expect the state dinner to begin in a few moments from now. But, you know, the optics of what's in fact played out since this morning in Washington, D.C. just goes on to highlight about the importance that the United States now places on India. Initially, when the Indian Prime Minister was set to leave, a lot was being talked about in terms of how the United States want to see India as an important defense partner, where the defense relationship was expected to grow. But this is much more comprehensive than that.
All right, we're going to need to move. Okay. Sorry, well, Mohammed, actually, we now need to move from this location. So we will be now moving from this location to the dinner is behind me. This was the place where the Indian Prime Minister was welcomed by the US President. But essentially, a lot of movement today from the entire area, whether it's White House, whether it's the Capitol Hill. And now, of course, the dinner commences. It will be a vegetarian dinner first. Secondly, millets will be given. Now, we know that India has been focusing on millets. This year is being marked as the year of the millets, and essentially the focus will be as to how there can be the informal meeting for the leaders to engage with themselves and who's who of the people who have arrived here.
Absolutely, indeed, Siddhant. We'll, of course, come back to you in just a bit, but Ms. Elizabeth Broy, if I can bring you in on this. You know, what is, of course, interesting is not just the optics, but also the subtext of what's, in fact, been playing out at the White House. The American president, not mincing words there, stating that this is a relationship that will redefine the 21st century. He also described this visit by the Indian Prime Minister as a point of inflection. I want you to weigh in a bit about how Europe, of course, views the changing geopolitics, especially in East Asia. Especially countries such as France and Germany, they have a different approach on how they would like to engage with China. But the United States has a completely divergent opinion on how China needs to be engaged with, which is what has prompted this realignment on the part of the Americans. What do you have to say for that?
It's certainly true that that's the shift in the U.S. in its views towards China has been much faster and much more radical than views in Europe. But we should also remember that it's not just about the views among politicians and political decision makers. It's also the views among ordinary citizens and the business community, because the relationship with China is not just about political relationship. It's all encompassing, and what we have seen in the business community is both in the US and in other countries is business leaders becoming very concerned about the risk of doing business in China and trying to reduce their exposure to China. Businesses from all over the Western world. And on top of that, what we have also seen, we are seeing at the moment, an incredible change in public views, attitudes towards China across the Western world, and not just the geographical West, but countries like Japan, Australia, New Zealand as well, where the public in those countries are becoming developing very strong doubts about China and whether that countries should be closely aligned with China. So that I think is that too contributes to this essentially becoming India's moment. There are so many people that have concerns about China, and India is essentially there waiting in the wings to take over China's leading role in the global economy and indeed in the global system.
Absolutely, indeed. And also, Ms. Broad, just to dwell a little deeper in terms of how this complex geopolitical puzzle, of course, will play out. Because at this moment, as we speak, there's this war in Ukraine that's been raging for well over 16, 17 months now. United States and Russia, of course, do not see eye to eye. And at this moment, probably there is a lot of chatter that there needs to be a neutral interlocutor who can, of course, pull the right kind of levers, which could probably bring in some kind of peace in the battlefields of Ukraine. Now, India has got an interesting and an important foreign policy. It has pursued a policy of strategic autonomy, by which it means that it does not ally itself with any one power center, but rather pursues a policy that is beneficial to its own people. By doing this, what India has done is that it has got very good relations with the West. It's also got equally good relations with Russia and to a certain extent with China as well. Now, with that being the context, do you think India and Prime Minister Modi can also be an interlocutor for peace between Russia and the West?
Let's hope so. We should be under no illusions about the difficulty of that task, because Russia doesn't want to end the war. It clearly wants to keep going until it has achieved some sort of significant gains significant enough for President Putin to be able to go back to the Russian people and say, look, it was worth the effort. Now we have so and so much Ukrainian territory that is ours. So it will be very difficult to mediate any sort of peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. But India certainly has a good shot at it. Now, we should remember that there is no shortage of countries trying to mediate. There's just been an African delegation of African leaders in Ukraine and Russia trying to mediate, but without any progress so far. But India, as you say, does have good relations with Russia without being under Russian domination. And so that would put India in a good position. And I think that the case to be made is that this war, it doesn't matter where you're located in the world, it would be a terrible thing for the world if another country could invade its neighbor and nobody would do anything about it. So that is the case I think India can make, that it's standing up for all the countries out there who risk being invaded by their neighbors.
Absolutely. My final question to you, Ms. Elizabeth Braw, is in terms of what is likely to be the future of Quad. Now, the Quad has got 4 democratic nations. It has got India, the United States, it's got Japan and Australia. This is not an alliance of sorts. This is, in fact, a grouping of democratic nations, and in some ways it has a huge bearing on the developments in the Indo-Pacific region. The Chinese have dismissed the Quad as the Eastern NATO. Do you think the Quad will now strengthen further?
Yeah, it's incredible, really. When the Quad was formed not that long ago, it seemed like a group in search of a mission. It seemed like a good idea for these countries to get together. It wasn't really clear what they were getting together to do. And now there is so much they can do together, both in trade, in upholding democratic values, in perhaps even defense cooperation, because relations with China have deteriorated so significantly in just the past couple of years. And there is enormous opportunity now for the Quad to develop this grouping into a proper alliance. And clearly, China is concerned about exactly that, or otherwise it wouldn't try to discredit the Quad in the public domain. And I think what will be interesting to see is how much these 4 countries manage to expand and enhance their trade relations, because India has always been a country that so many companies have been wanting to invest in, especially in manufacturing, but there have always been problems with red tape and bureaucracy and so forth. If these 4 countries manage to enhance the trade relations between these four countries and make India, for example, an attractive and efficient destination for companies in these other countries to manufacturing, that could be a fantastic benefit.
Absolutely, indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Elizabeth Braw, for joining us and getting us all those insights there. And meanwhile, my colleague Siddhant Sibal is joining us back on this broadcast. Now, Siddhant, we just saw the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi being welcomed by the Bidens there. He's now, we're given to understand, just stepped inside of the White House. And in a few moments from now, the state dinner will, of course, get underway. There are about an estimated 400-odd guests who are on the invite list, who will, of course, be taking part. We see the Ambanis, a prominent business family from India, who are, of course, going to be a part of this state dinner. Siddhant, now this is a important... All right, we seem to have lost the line with my colleague Siddhant Sibal. Will try and get him back on the line again. But this is a crucial moment. It's got everything in it. This is diplomacy at its very best. This is history as it is unfolding right in front of our eyes. Because what we are looking at is the United States waking up to a new geopolitical reality. The United States quite clearly is in need of allies because major European powers such as France and Germany have got a completely divergent approach in terms of how they intend to engage with China. Now remember, India and China have got issues of their own. The Chinese have a problem with the borders that India has with China. The Chinese do not recognize these borders that India inherited at the time of its independence. At the time that India became independent, the Chinese did not raise a lot of these objections that they are now coming up with. They're bringing out these strange ancient maps where they say that some territory belonged to some particular kingdom of China, some empire of China sometime in the past, and therefore that territory belongs to them. These are the kind of arguments that the Chinese have been putting forth, and ever since that gruesome and the deadly clash that took place on the 15th of June in the Galwan Valley in 2020, the border standoff between India and China has been a serious one. So there are obvious tensions between India and China, but except for that, the other aspects of the India-China equation are, of course, pretty robust. But what we are looking at in terms of how the geopolitics is playing out is that the United States, which is at this moment the most militarily powerful and economically the most dominant nation in the world, is sensing a certain threat to its position at the top of the perch by the Chinese, who are making rapid strides. Which is why the United States is obviously looking for allies to somehow try and blunt the rise of China. For the last decade and a half, the American policy has been dictated with one burning ambition, and that has been to try and somehow to contain the rise of China. And this realignment that the United States is attempting is quite clearly because of the rise of China that we are looking at, and that is the unstated elephant in the room. So when you look at what is unfolding at this moment at the White House, you need to also recognize the elephant in the room, which is China, which is quite clearly absent. But the Americans are pulling out all stops in order to try and woo India to see whether India can be weaned away from the Russian military hardware and whether India can in fact be made a more closer ally. But remember, the Indian foreign policy is dictated by a very practical and a principled approach. The time of non-alignment has perhaps ended after the end of the Cold War, where there are no more two big superpowers who are having a go at each other. But at this moment, as we speak, India's foreign policy is dictated by a very practical consideration, and this is that of strategic autonomy. India follows a foreign policy that is in the interest of India's own people, which is why India, despite the fact that there are contending powers in the world, has good speaking relations with pretty much every camp there is, and which is why India is such an important power of its own. And a lot of analysts also in fact indicate that India is a pole of its own, and this is something that India has not openly come out and stated, but this remains a fact which has been recognized by other major powers, which is why India is taken so seriously. in the geopolitical context. So we expect the state dinner to begin any moment now. The guests are still walking in. They're making their way into the White House for the state dinner that's been laid out for the Indian Prime Minister, who's a state guest in the United States of America at this moment. And we also earlier heard the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi address the American joint sitting of the Congress, where he touched upon several aspects. Let's in fact listen in to what the Indian Prime Minister had to say.
In the past few years, there have been many advances in AI, artificial intelligence. At the same time, there have been even more momentous development in another AI, America and India. There are millions here who have roots in India. Some of them sit proudly in this chamber. And there is one behind me who has made history. I am told that the Samosa caucus is now the flavor of the house. I hope it grows and brings the full diversity of Indian cuisine here. Our clouds of convergence and confrontation are casting their shadow in the Indo-Pacific. The stability of the region has become one of the central concerns of our partnership. We share a vision of a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. Connected by secure seas, defined by international law, free from domination, and anchored in ASEAN centrality. Terrorism is an enemy of humanity, and there can be no ifs and buts in dealing with it. We must overcome all such forces sponsoring and exporting terror. Giving a voice to the global South is the way forward. That is why I firmly believe that the African Union be given full membership of G20. We must revive multilateralism and reform multilateral institutions with better resources and representation that applies to all our global institutions of governance, especially the United Nations.
So that was the Indian Prime Minister there talking about various aspects that he touched upon as a part of his address to the joint sitting of the Congress. And what is also interesting is that this visit by the Indian Prime Minister has got pretty much everything. The Indian Prime Minister has met with the thought leaders, he's met with the business leaders, he also met with Elon Musk, the man who's now the owner of the micro-blogging site Twitter. And he also later, of course, has had several other engagements, like, for instance, he led the World International Day of Yoga, and he did that at the United Nations headquarters. And since then, since this morning, he's been very busy in Washington, D.C. at the White House. At the lawns of the White House, he in fact narrated a personal anecdote as to how 30 years ago he had come as a common citizen to the United States of America, and he had looked at the White House from outside of his fence. He was just a common citizen, and therefore he could never hope to enter into the White House back then, 30 years ago. But since he's become the Prime Minister, he's been to the White House several times, but this is his first time as a state visit that he's visiting the United States. And he also said something very interesting, that back then, when he had come as a normal citizen, he could not have got inside the lawns of the White House. But then he pointed out at the number, several hundreds of Indian American members of the diaspora who were present in the White House, and he said that this is a proud moment for people of Indian origin who are present in such big numbers inside the lawns of the White House. And also in an unprecedented and a historic development after the much-awaited bilateral meeting, we saw the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, along with the American President Joe Biden, address a press conference at the White House. And the Indian Prime Minister also, for the very first time, took questions from reporters at a press conference. Now, during the questions that were posed, the Indian Prime Minister was asked as to what steps his government was taking to improve the rights of minorities in India, something that was questioned by the former President of the United States, Barack Obama, in an interview just a little while earlier today. Now, in response, the Indian Prime Minister, of course, stressed upon how deeply ingrained the ideals of democracy are for the people of India, and how it's actually now a part of Indian history. That democracy is a part of Indian history, and the way democracy is run in India is now in the DNA of the people of India. Listen to what the Indian Prime Minister had to say to a question that was asked during the press conference about his track record on how the minorities are being treated in India. Listen to the response by the Indian Prime Minister.
मुझे आश्चर्य हो रहा है कि आप कह रहे हैं कि लोग कहते हैं नहीं, भारत डेमोक्रेसी है। और जैसा राष्ट्रपति बाइडेन ने कहा, भारत और अमेरिका दोनों के डीएनए में लोकतंत्र है। लोकतंत्र हमारा स्पिरिट है, लोकतंत्र हमारी रगों में है, लोकतंत्र को हम जीते हैं, और हमारे पूर्वजों ने उसको शब्दों में ढाला है संविधान के रूप में। और हमारी सरकार लोकतंत्र के मूलभूत मूल्यों को आधार लेकर के बने हुए संविधान के आधार पर चलती है। और हमारा संविधान और हमारी सरकार, और हमने सिद्ध किया है डेमोक्रेसी कैन डिलीवर। और जब मैं डिलीवर कहता हूं तब कास्ट, क्रीड, रिलीजन, जेंडर, किसी भी भेदभाव को वहां जगह नहीं होती है। और जब हम लोकतंत्र की बात करते हैं, तब अगर ह्यूमन वैल्यूज नहीं है, ह्यूमैनिटी नहीं है, ह्यूमन राइट्स नहीं है, फिर तो वो डेमोक्रेसी है ही नहीं। और इसलिए जब आप डेमोक्रेसी कहते हैं, जब डेमोक्रेसी को स्वीकार करते हैं और जब हम डेमोक्रेसी को लेकर के जीते हैं, तब डिस्क्रिमिनेशन का कोई सवाल ही नहीं उठता है। और इसलिए भारत सबका साथ, सबका विकास, सबका विश्वास, सबका प्रयास, उन मूलभूत सिद्धांतों को लेकर के, और इसलिए हम चलते हैं। भारत में सरकार के जो बेनिफिट्स हैं वो एक्सेस टू ऑल है, जो भी उसके हकदार हैं उन सबको मिलते हैं। इसलिए भारत के लोकतांत्रिक मूल्यों में कोई भेदभाव नहीं है, न धर्म के आधार पर, न जाति के आधार पर, न उम्र के आधार पर, न भूभाग के आधार पर।
All right, so that was the response by the Indian Prime Minister when he was asked about his track record of how minorities in India are in fact being treated in his tenure. Now, the Indian Prime Minister also underlined that there is no space for discrimination in the constitution of the country. And all citizens are, of course, viewed as the same. Listen.
Constitution and our government, we have always proved that democracy can deliver. And when I say deliver, this is regardless of caste, creed, religion, gender. There's absolutely no space for discrimination. And when you talk of democracy,
The US President Joe Biden was also asked to comment on the statements made by his party members who claimed that the current administration is in fact overlooking the alleged targeting of religious minorities in India. Now here was the response.
We're straightforward with each other and we respect each other. One of the fundamental reasons that I believe the U.S.-China relationship is not in the space it is in the U.S.-Indian relationship is that there's an overwhelming respect for each other because we're both democracies. And it's a common democratic character of both our countries that, and our people, our diversity, our culture, our open, tolerant, robust debate. And I believe that we believe in the dignity of every citizen. And it is in America's DNA, and I believe in India's DNA, that the whole world has a stake in our success, both of us, in maintaining our democracies, makes us appealing partners, and enables us to expand democratic institutions around the world. And I believe this, and I still believe this.
Now, what is interesting is just before the Indian Prime Minister and the American President stepped up for that press conference, there was this interview of the former American President Barack Obama, which he had given to an American private news channel, in which Barack Obama had raised some serious concerns about ethnic minorities in India. Barack Obama in that interview had said, and I quote him here, "If I had a conversation with Prime Minister Modi, who I know well, part of my argument would be that if you do not protect the rights of ethnic minorities in India, then there is a strong possibility that at some point India starts pulling apart." So that is what Barack Obama, of course, said as a part of his interview that interestingly played out pretty much at the time that the Indian Prime Minister was having his bilateral meeting with the American President inside the premises of the White House. And quite obviously, when the two leaders, of course, stepped up for their press briefing, there were questions that were asked, and one of the reporters, of course, asked the question of how the minorities were being treated in India to the Indian Prime Minister, for which he, of course, gave a pretty comprehensive answer of sorts. And this is a visit that, remember, that's seen several aspects of how the dynamics between India and the United States will play out. That's the Indian Prime Minister there being escorted by the First Lady and the President of the United States of America, President Biden, and the First Lady Jill Biden, as the state dinner is expected to commence in a few moments from now. And joining us in this broadcast, we've got Susan Tehrani, my colleague, who's been tracking the story very, very closely for us since this morning. Now, Susan, what we've been witnessing since this morning is history in the making. This is a major realignment that we're looking at, where the India-US equation is going to strengthen quite remarkably from here. You know, earlier when it was being talked about, it was being speculated that the defense deals will, of course, make the headlines, but that's just not it. It's the optics and also the many other aspects of what's been going on that are making the headlines as the Indian Prime Minister has been hosted at the White House today.
Yeah, that's very true, considering the fact that this relationship has really evolved throughout the years on the one hand, and it's really culminated to this state visit only being the third official state invite by President Biden during his presidency. It's a very dynamic relationship, and I think we saw that during the press conference when the two leaders spoke. And then we also heard from Prime Minister Modi addressing Congress and talking about the similarities between the two biggest democracies and also the challenges that both of them face, in a very frank way. But I think it's very interesting that both sides, like you mentioned, we've really focused on the defense aspect of it, the technology aspect of this meeting, which are all very valid. But both sides are really focusing on this people-to-people dialogue and connection, not only between Indian Americans, but also between Americans and Indians, and how both sides can collaborate and help one another. And I think that was very interesting as well.
Absolutely indeed. And also the Indian Prime Minister is at this moment being hosted for a state dinner. There are 400 odd guests. We're given to understand that the menu is vegan and not just vegetarian, and most of these dishes have been made out of millets. What more information do we have on that front?
Yeah, well, it's being crafted by a chef that's very known and very renowned for this movement of the plant-based movement, which understandably she would go with a vegan menu than just a solely vegetarian one, since there are so many great options right now. So we do know, as you mentioned, that the appetizer will be millet. We do know that the main course will be based around a portobello mushroom that we've heard is going to be decorated and stuffed with other vegetables, and also saffron risotto, and a number of white wines and red wines. And also for the dessert, we can't undermine that. It's going to be some kind of shortcake, cardamom shortcake with strawberries. So I think it'll be very, very interesting we'll see the pictures, but I think we were fortunate enough to at least get an understanding of how it tastes. VOA's Jessica Stone, she had a taste and she updated us about how delicious it was.
Indeed, indeed. And the Indian Prime Minister, of course, has got this reputation of being a very sparing eater, and it'll be interesting to see as to what he makes of this menu, this lavish banquet that's in fact being served at the White House there at the moment as we speak. But Susan, looking at the optics of what has also played out, and the standing ovations that the Indian Prime Minister got as he made that address to the joint sitting of the Congress, he touched upon several aspects. He also has this knack of coming up with these acronyms, and that's one of the reasons as to why he's also so popular in India as well. And he came up with another very interesting acronym today where he redefined how AI will now be perceived. AI is not just artificial intelligence, but AI, he said, is America and India. And the two nations have come much closer. So is this within the American media also being looked at as a point of inflection, between in the relationship between India and the United States of America?
Yeah, absolutely. This is relations with India, and expanding relations with India is one of those rare points that there is consensus, bipartisan consensus on Capitol Hill between Republicans and most Democrats. And so we're really going to see this relationship flourish. And I think it was very interesting and nuanced from Prime Minister Modi, although we've heard his speeches before, even at the UN and elsewhere. He always has a positive tone at the end of the day when he's delivering these speeches, even when he's talking about challenges. And I think because we've talked so much about the disruption that may be caused by artificial intelligence and the challenges about disinformation and misinformation that the United States has really been focusing on, I think it was a light moment that Prime Minister Modi looked at the positive aspect of AI being America and Indian relations. So that was very interesting to see. And also, Mohammed, I thought it was very interesting that he also talked about the Samosa Caucus, which is basically an informal grouping of Indian American lawmakers who are either part of the House of Representatives or the Senate. Right. And he said that it seems like it's the flavor of the day. So that was very interesting as well.
Absolutely, indeed. And that's an interesting point that he made. And then he turned around and he looked at Kamala Harris and he said that, there are millions of Indians who live in America that have Indian American citizens. And then he said there are quite a few who've now made it to the American legislature. And then he, of course, turned around and looked at Kamala Harris, the vice president. And that was a very interesting exchange that took place between the Indian Prime Minister and the American Vice President. But Susan, behind the optics, what's also very interesting is, behind these geopolitical realignments that are taking place, the force that is pulling some of these levers of realignment was absent in the White House. And this is the overarching challenge that China, of course, presents in the Asia-Pacific region. And the United States and some of its European allies, such as France and Germany, do not have a point of convergence on how they intend to, in fact, engage with China, which is one of the reasons why it is being talked about that the United States wants to ally itself much more closely with India. How much of convergence do you think the United States and India will have?
True. And although the United States and India on some aspects on how to deal with China may not see eye to eye, but for the most part, they do align. And their interests are aligned. It's a strategic partnership at the end of the day. And a safe and open Indo-Pacific, for example, is to the benefit of both nations. And also the issue of supply chain. I mean, if COVID had any lessons, one of the major lessons was to not rely on a single source because of the disruption that we saw in the supply chain. So I think the United States is very wary of that. India is as well. And once the United States has India by its side, then I think European countries will be more keen on countering China. At the end of the day, they look at their national interests and they see that their trade relations with China right now is quite important, considering the fact that they've lost that business with Russia because of the sanctions, and other countries are, moving forward, working with China. So they have that Chinese dependency. But to decouple completely, yes, the United States and India aligning will sort of set that roadmap for other countries, Western countries at least, to move forward as well. And I think, the meeting with Tesla CEO Elon Musk, I think, was very noteworthy for the private sector.
Absolutely, indeed. Susan, do continue to stay on with us. Meanwhile, I'm told that we've got my colleague Siddhant Sibal who's also joining us on this broadcast. Now, Siddhant, we've spoken, exhaustively about every aspect of what's in fact going on in the White House. But some of these security analysts and strategists are talking about, the possibility of India also playing perhaps potentially the role of the interlocutor. They've been tracking the story very closely there from the White House. Has this topic been at all brought up by the American side to the Indian side?
Well, Mohammed, this topic is something that has been part of the conversation when it comes to China or other geopolitical issues. But let me first talk to you about where I'm standing and where I have come from. I've come from the state banquet, which is still underway. In fact, it has just started, and the Indian Prime Minister is meeting all the guests. But we saw those visuals of the American President Joe Biden and the First Lady Jill Biden welcoming the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the White House. And of course, this is a star-studded celebration of the relationship. We also know that when it comes to state banquets, It is part of the diplomatic honor which is usually bestowed on a visiting leader of a country. And now we also know that this is a state visit. This is an official state visit, the third official state visit that the Biden administration is taking care of. And as part of it, it is according the highest diplomatic honor on the Indian Prime Minister. Now, it's all vegetarian, first of all. Secondly, millets are being used. We know that India has been calling for usage of millets and has been saying that this is a superfood which should be used as much as possible. But all in all, the top policymakers, the top influencers right now in that building, that's the White House behind me, meeting with each other. And that shows that how essentially the people of the two countries are coming closer, whether it's at the highest level or whether it is at the common level. We know that the announcement has been made that US will be opening consulates in India, including in Ahmedabad, and India will be opening its consulate in Seattle. And when countries announce these kinds of development, that shows that how eager the people of respective countries are keen to go to each other's country, whether it's travel, whether it's for better opportunities, whether it's for education. And all through the day, while there was a lot of focus on diplomacy related to security challenges regarding China, of course, and other related issues, there was essentially a celebration as well, given that there were large number of members of the Indian diaspora present both at the South Lawn of the White House and also in the U.S. Congress as well. We heard the chanting by the diaspora members in the U.S. Congress, the second address by the Indian Prime Minister to the U.S. Congress. So essentially that is something that India has been trying to focus at, and it is being termed as a living bridge between the two countries. We will see more such visuals tomorrow when the Indian Prime Minister addresses the members of the diaspora here in Washington, something that has been permanent fixture of his foreign visits abroad. But today, of course, the big focus is as to how relationship can be further solidified and cemented.
Absolutely, indeed. That of course, has been a key aspect of, of the diplomacy that's been done today. And Susan, if I can bring you in on this, what we are looking at is history in the making. A key geostrategic realignment that's in fact taken place. The question that I want to ask you is, the Indian Prime Minister, this is the second time that he's addressed the joint sitting of the Congress. This is a rare honor that is accorded for leaders who are extremely important for the Americans in terms of their foreign policy. What does this say about how closely the United States wants to ally itself with India?
It's a very, very noteworthy event. And I do want to say that it's, you were talking about Barack Obama and that interview. It's interesting to note that the first time he addressed Congress was during Barack Obama's presidency. And it's easier to perhaps waive criticism when you're not in office and give that interview. But when he was in office, if we look at the headlines and the way Barack Obama was praising Prime Minister Modi, it's very different from the tone that he had during that interview today. But, it's important. It's important because not only did he address Congress before, but the fact that he's addressing it again right now just shows how the world has changed and how it was important for the United States, as you mentioned, to once again realign itself with its allies and hear the message that another big democracy is sending to the world as well. One has to wonder whether or not even the timing of President Biden calling Xi Jinping a dictator was calculated or not, considering the fact that he's stressed so much on the fact his whole foreign policy is basically about democracy versus autocracy and the winning and the success of democracy depends on the peace of the global community. And, always talking about countries like Russia and countries like China as well. So, it was very important for Prime Minister Modi to bring that message to the U.S. Congress. And as I mentioned, it's one of those rare aspects where there is bipartisan support relationship with India. I think that it's also very important for the United States to try to ally India, as you mentioned, in the defense sector as well, because for the most part, India has been working with Russia and trading with Russia when it comes to defense. So those aspects of it and the technological aspect of it, the business aspect of it, money was very important, but I think ideology was also very important during this address.
I think you've summed it up really, really well there. Thank you very much indeed to Susan Tehrani and also to my colleague Siddhant Sibil for joining us and getting us all those details. So the state banquet, the state dinner, presently as we speak, is underway, and we'll of course get more details as they emerge. But for the time being, though, we'll slip into a short break. More news and updates will continue on the other side. Stay tuned to WION.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister of the Republic of India.
Namaskar. America and India.
Resort is unique, the only one of its kind. Experience the 4 paths of natural wellness: yoga, Ayurveda, acupuncture, and naturopathy. Each uniquely customized program improves the whole person to make every person whole. Come to WION Health Resort. Make your reservation at WION.com.
After the collapse of the Kherson Dam and the deluge caused, fighting intensifies between the Ukrainian and the Russian forces. As the much talked about Ukrainian counter-offensive seems to be getting underway, France, Germany and Poland firm up talks on the security guarantees Ukraine desperately needs. All eyes are now on NATO leaders' July summit in the Lithuanian capital. Will it focus on Ukraine's push for accession to NATO?
Who will be the next US president? As Trump gears up to take on Biden, his deputy Pence calls him unfit. But it's DeSantis who is drumming up support. A dozen Republicans in the fray and counting. Will a crowded contest benefit Trump? Race for the White House on WION. World is one.
Gravitas tells you stories which others won't. And tonight we will tell you about this new strategic map that is being drawn.
They say your enemy's enemy is your friend. Is that the foundation of the new defense bridge between India and America?
This is what separates us from others who claim to be telling you global stories that matter. In the last 3 days, WION has been traveling across Syria. You are in Latakia city right now. Tell us, what is the situation on ground? At Gravitas, we don't just tell you stories from selected countries from around the world.
2 years since the Myanmar military coup, the people of Myanmar continue to live in a nightmare.
Because it does not suit their propaganda, or because they are too scared to speak truth to power.
Stay connected with the world through WION. Like the page on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter for new alerts. Instagram for videos and images. And the website for the latest news, views and analysis. WIONews.com. World is one.
Welcome back and thank you for staying with us. This is WION The World is One. We are glad you're watching. I'm American Joker. Let's begin with our top stories. Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the state dinner hosted in his honor at the White House. The Indian Prime Minister celebrates the bond between what he called the world's two great democracies as he addressed a joint meeting in Congress. US President Joe Biden joins visiting Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in warning Pakistan to crack down on terrorists that target New Delhi. All 5 people on board a submersible missing near the wreck of the Titanic are dead and likely in an instant after their vessel suffered a catastrophic implosion in the ocean depths. Canadian news parent company Meta says that Facebook and Instagram users in Canada will be blocked from viewing after Ottawa passed a bill requiring digital giants to pay for such content.